Chapter 6, Ginger. It's hard to find distractions while you're waiting for someone to come back with the booze, especially at one of my family's barbecues. My mother could be lurking around the corner, and a drink or two always made that easier to deal with. I hadn't seen Blue all afternoon. I don't know why I was bothered by it. If I was still married, he would have been here bright and early this morning with bells on. I glanced around the backyard. Most of the people I didn't recognize. Malibu was up on the porch with Risa, and man, he was pouring it on thick. Risa seemed to be enjoying it. Well, if it helps her get her groove back, then I was all for it. I saw Mary, my brother's wife, walking across the yard toward me. Their kids, 2 boys, were teenagers now, and both were draped in girls. Mitchell and Jimmy were good-looking boys, and the girls they were with were your garden variety beauty queen types. Mary and I greeted each other with a hug. "Where's my brother?" I asked. I couldn't understand why Ryan wasn't here. He lived for this shit. "Working," she said, in a voice that let me know she wasn't pleased. I said, "What? Why is he working?" I was starting to feel like something was terribly wrong. If I have to be here, so should he. "Well, it's not his fault." Mary's tone had turned forgiving. "What do you mean?" I asked. She said, "Mike told him if he didn't hold down the fort today, he's fired." "What?" My mouth dropped open. "Why would he do that?" Mary shook her head. "Lately, Mike's been impossible to work with. Ryan's been looking for another job, but times are tough." "How long has this been going on?" I asked. I could make a good guess that it dated back to around the time Mike started fooling around on Risa. Mary said, "Let's just say that I think Mike's trying to divorce the entire family." Well, wasn't that an interesting development? Wait till I tell Georgia. This news would definitely seal the deal on the notion of calling Mike's loan. "Karma has a way of taking care of people like Mike," I said, to give her hope. I couldn't spill the beans about Georgia funding Mike's car dealership. That was not my secret to tell. Mary nodded toward the porch, asking, "Who's the eye candy with Risa?" I said, "Oh, that's Malibu. He's a friend of mine and George's." "Where is Georgia?" Mary asked, looking around. "She and Tommy went to the liquor store," I said. She laughed a little. "Do tell." "Yeah, long story," I said. Mary got this mischievous look on her face. "Check that out." She nodded, looking behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. Blue. The sight of him made my knees go weak. He walked right up to me and embraced me, saying, "I've been wondering when you were going to get here." "We arrived yesterday," I said, hugging him back, "and God help me, I liked it." "I heard," he said, laughing a little before pulling back from me. "I thought about coming to see you last night." I said, "Oh?" I was a little put out that he'd thought about it, and somewhere along the line he'd decided not to. "You thought about it, huh?" I said. "I didn't want to appear too eager," he said, with a hint of a snicker. "Yeah, I'm not so appealing now that I'm divorced, huh?" I said and turned away. He caught my arm. I turned back to look at my arm, and then I let my gaze travel up to meet his. "Don't get all worked up," he said, like my fury had no merit. "You still owe me a walk." "In case you hadn't noticed," I said, "I'm a little busy with my niece's wedding." "To my nephew," he pointed out. Like I needed to be reminded of that, I huffed out my frustration. This game was kind of fun when we were kids, but I was a grown woman now, with 4 failed marriages under my belt, and I didn't need Blue Ramsey messing with my head. I looked around. mainly as a means to regain my composure, and saw Mike. He had his hands on his hips, and he was standing behind Malibu and Risa, who were still sitting on the swing. "What's his deal?" I said of Mike, who was blatantly glaring at Risa and Malibu. Blue followed my gaze and chuckled. "I guess Mike wasn't expecting that." "I guess not," I said. "Nothing made a man want a woman more than another man entering the picture. Maybe that would make Mike come to his senses. But I wasn't so sure that he deserved my sister anymore." "Let's go up to the falls." Blue's enticing voice lulled me toward a yes. I shook my head, hoping to rid myself of this ongoing fascination with him. It wasn't a good idea to revisit the past with Blue Ramsey. He'd broken my heart years ago, and it had taken me a long time to get over it. "Maybe tomorrow," I said and shrugged, looking up at him. "Why not today?" he asked. "Because by tomorrow I'll have found a good excuse not to go." But I said, "We promised Malibu we'd take him to tangos tonight." "Malibu?" Blue said. I nodded toward Risa. Blue looked up toward the house, and his eyes fixed on Risa and Malibu for a moment. Finally, he said, "Where'd she find him?" with a measure of distaste in his tone. I said, "Me and Georgia brought him for her." Blue's eyes shot toward me. He was clearly threatened by Malibu now. Good. It wouldn't hurt Blue to realize that he wasn't the only fish in the sea. "Relax," I said, and I couldn't help laughing inside. "We're just friends." "He gay?" Malibu asked, and it was more of a hopeful inquiry than an observation. To his dismay, I shook my head. I said, "Why do you guys always assume that when I say Malibu and I are just friends?" I found it frustrating, to say the least. "Relax," he mocked me. "I'm kidding." Then he laughed at me. I smacked him and turned away. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, but something told me that Blue was hot on my trail. Chapter 7. Georgia. The liquor store Tommy and I went to was in a building that I recognized as housing the Washateria laundromat back in the day. I was actually kind of thrilled to see something familiar. We got out of Tommy's truck and went inside the store. I tried to imagine the aisles of liquor being replaced by rows of washers and dryers, but I couldn't quite conjure up the image. I'd never been inside the place when it was the laundromat. Tommy took my hand and I nearly died as he led me to the aisle with the rum and vodka. The shelves were lined with enticing flavors like coconut, mango, and black cherry. Curiosity pushed me to keep reading the labels. Iced cake, kissed caramel, root beer float, fluffed marshmallow, peach red, banana, and key lime. Suddenly, I felt old. "Geez," I said, "it's a good thing we didn't have all these tasty-sounding choices when we were teenagers." I shook my head. "I would have ended up a drunk." Tommy said with a chuckle, "It does read a bit like the candy aisle, doesn't it?" His boundless green eyes sparkled as he looked at me. I liked looking into his eyes. In fact, I was pretty confident that I'd be happy doing that for the rest of my life. Yeah, right. Dream on. I turned my attention back to the liquor, asking, "How the hell do you choose one?" "Easy," Tommy said, and grabbed a random bottle off the shelf. He glanced at the label, then offered it to me. "Here," he said. "Banana's your favorite, right?" he asked, then winked at me. I was holding on to the bottle, and so was he. He said, "God, it's good to see you, Georgia." With his free hand, he touched the side of my face and said, "It's been too long." Still touching my cheek, Tommy rested his forehead against mine. I laid my free hand against his chest, enjoying the feel of him. "Yes, it has. was all I could say. My heart was pounding, 90 to nothing. If I started talking, I might make a fool out of myself. Tommy pulled his head away from mine and glanced around. He looked at me with a grin, tipping the corners of his mouth. "We're starting to attract a crowd," he said, nodding subtly toward the front windows. Stealthily, I kept my eyes toward the front and saw 7 or 8 people standing outside, staring in at us. Tommy said, "Let's get out of here." We took the banana rum to the cashier. Tommy paid and took hold of my hand as we headed for the door. On the way over, I'd talked to him about the chick at the grocery store, so he knew how anxious I was about the crowd outside. We went outside, and it wasn't just the humidity that had me sweating. A woman in her late 20s or early 30s rushed toward me. I wanted to shut my eyes, but more than that, I didn't want Tommy to witness my humiliation. "Georgia Franklin?" she asked, and I wanted to die. Tommy squeezed my hand to let me know he had my back. I liked it. The girl said, "It is you, isn't it?" Her eyes grew wide to match her grin. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I just love your music. I felt like you were singing that song, Remember Me, just for me." She lifted her cell. "Would you take a picture with me?" Once I realized she was a fan, I was back in my element. I said I'd be honored. I posed with her for a couple of shots. Tommy took the pictures and seemed happy to do it. Then a couple more people asked for pictures, and we obliged, me posing with them and Tommy snapping the pictures. He had a smile on his face and was laughing and joking with the townspeople. He was more than happy to be the man behind the scenes. We chatted with the people a few minutes, then Tommy grabbed my hand as we excused ourselves and headed for his truck. Inside, he looked at me as he turned the key and started the engine. He said, "See, not everybody in Cypress Falls hates you." I'll admit, it did set my mind to rest a little, knowing that at least 7 or 8 people in town held no ill will toward me. I said, "Well, I was with the sheriff." "See," he said, shifting into reverse, "I'm useful to have around." I said, "I've always suspected as much." We both laughed. He maneuvered his truck onto the street and merged with the traffic. After we'd traveled a couple of blocks, I said, "Tommy, I feel like I need to tell you something." Since Tommy was Mike's best friend, it was in my best interest, if I wanted to remain friends with him, to clue him in on what was about to happen. "I'm listening," he said cautiously. "It's about Mike," I said. Tommy cleared his throat and ran his fingers over his short hair. He didn't say anything, so I continued. "I don't know how much Mike has told you," I said. Aside from Ginger, I'd never told a soul about funding Mike's business venture, known as Russell's Ford. "To be honest," Tommy said, "Mike and I don't talk much these days." I looked at Tommy. That was hard to believe. I wondered what had caused it. "Everything okay?" I asked. This was not a time for the father of the bride and the father of the groom to be feuding. "Yeah," Tommy shrugged, saying, "He's just turned into someone I don't know or like very much anymore." I said, "How much do you know about Russell's Ford?" I put it out there, hoping his reaction would tell me how he'd take the news I had to share. He said softly, "I know that Mike got the money for the dealership from you." "You knew that?" I asked. He nodded. My tone was weaker than I'd anticipated when I asked, "How long?" "I suspected it all along," he said. It wasn't hard to put 2 and 2 together. Tommy glanced at me and grinned. "Mike doesn't know too many people with that kind of money." "Well, I had to loan him the money," I said. "There was Risa and Lisa to think about. Plus, he agreed that my brother Ryan would always have a job." "To be honest," Tommy said, "you're the reason we're not speaking." "Me?" I asked, What'd I do? Tommy said, a few months ago, he told me about you and the money. He also said that he had no intentions of paying you back either. He thinks you owe him, Tommy said, and I thought he might laugh if he weren't so visibly annoyed. Tommy shook his head at him. I just can't get with that. That's good to know, I said, and you won't be too upset with me when I call the loan. You're calling the loan? Tommy's mouth dropped open. He's never paid me back a dime on the loan, I said. And as long as he was with Risa, I didn't care. But now that he's left her, I shrugged at him. I don't feel any special kind of loyalty toward Mike. I'm going to turn the dealership over to Risa and Ryan. Good for you, Georgia, Tommy laughed. Good for you. I looked out the window. Cheney Road, just like the rest of the town, was unrecognizable. The farmhouses that used to dot this road had been replaced long ago, from the looks of it, by stores and shops and strip malls. I sighed heavily. My Cypress Falls was gone. When we got back to my parents' house with the booze, Ginger took it, passed it off to Jeffrey Dean, and told him and Tommy to go sneak it into the punch. After a fair amount of defiance, Tommy and Jeffrey Dean took off, and Ginger pulled me farther away from the party guest. What's going on? I asked, eager to protest. I've been having fun with Tommy, and Ginger was spoiling it. You're not going to believe this, she said, glancing around to see who might be within earshot. She added, while you were gone, I ran into Mary. Is Ryan here? I asked, looking around. I wanted to talk to my brother. That's just it, Ginger said. He's not here. Why not? I asked. According to Mary, she said, either he works today or he's fired. By who? I asked. Mike, she said. I couldn't imagine Mike being ballsy enough to do that. If he was trying to piss me off, he was succeeding. I needed to find my brother and tell him not to let Mike bully him. That, before I left here, Ryan would own half of Russell's Ford, and Risa would own the other. Chapter 8. Ginger. In Cypress Falls, anybody who was capable of staying up past 9 o'clock ended up at Tango's after the sun went down. For all that had changed about my hometown, the interior of Tango's looked exactly the same. Well, little things might have changed, like the tables, chairs, and bar stools. They were probably different. The flooring, too. But the walls were still a dark red, just like they used to be back in the day. And the front door, it still creaked when it opened and closed. This must have offered Georgia a measure of comfort, since she'd been distressed about the current state of our hometown since arriving yesterday. Blue and I made a trip to the bar for a round of drinks. I was pretty impressed that he remembered most of what everybody had ordered. A list of 13 or 14 drinks, at least. A bartender, a young good-looking guy in his 20s, prepared the mixed drinks we'd ordered, while Tango fished a few beers out of the cooler and set them on a second tray for us. Then he leaned against the bar across from me. So, Ginger, Tango said, think we can get Georgia and Risa together on stage before y'all leave? For old time's sake, he looked at me with hopeful eyes. I hated the thought of disappointing Tango, so I said, Georgia would probably be game. Times like this, it was better to let a person down easily. So I said, but I doubt you'd get Risa to agree. I grabbed a beer off the tray, the Modelo, and knocked back a healthy swig. Well, Tango said, if anybody can talk her into it. He didn't have to tell me the rest. We both knew what he meant, as he eyed me with this "you can do it" sort of gaze. "I'd really like to help you out, Tango," I said, and waited to see if he would let me off the hook. He didn't. So I said, "I'll see what I can do." I pushed myself up from the bar stool, saying, "But I'm not making any promises." I set my beer on the tray of brews and picked up the tray and headed off. Blue had the other tray, which I found a little amusing. The great pro baseball player himself delivering drinks. If that didn't beat all. He said to me, "I don't think you're going to get Risa to agree to sing with Georgia," as we made our way back to our table. "I don't think I am either," I said. Then again, he said, "You never know." We passed mixed drinks and bottles of beer around the table before reclaiming our seats. Risa was looking pretty happy on the other side of the table, basking in the glow of Malibu's attention. Maybe he had softened her up enough that she'd say yes. Well, I could hope. I took my beer and went to her side. I sat down in the chair Lisa had vacated only moments before when she and Ethan got up to dance. I might as well bite the bullet now, I thought, before I lost my nerve. I elbowed Risa. She looked over her shoulder at me, and I could see the annoyance in her eyes. It made me wonder what Malibu had been saying to her. "What?" she asked with a bite. Her barking at me like that made me want to run back to the other side of the table, in the safety of Blue's company. As dangerous as he was to my heart, he was far safer than Risa if she didn't like what I had to say, and I had a feeling she was going to hate it. So, I'm not sure why I said, "So, Tango says he'd really appreciate it if you and Georgia would sing a song or two before me and her head back to California." Her tone was calm as she asked, "Together?" But I knew it was a trap. I tread lightly, saying, "That's the general idea." "Me and Georgia," she said. "Sing together?" Her tone hardened as she talked. I could tell it was a no-go when she said, "You're kidding, right?" I tried using reverse psychology on her, saying, "Well, you wouldn't be doing it for Georgia. You'd be doing it for Tango." It didn't work. Risa simply laughed at me. At that moment it hit me. My eldest sister wouldn't be easily swayed. I stood and made one last bid at the reverse psychology thing, saying, "If you want to let Georgia stand in the limelight all alone," I shrugged, then added, "because we both know that she'll get up there if Tango asks her to." I gave Risa one last lingering look, then went back to my seat on the other side of the table where Blue was waiting for me. He leaned toward me. "Let me guess," he said. She said no. All I could manage was a half shrug and the beginnings of a nod. "We should have gone to the falls," he said. I was starting to think he was right. I just wanted to get away from my sister's feud that had been going on far too long, and spending too much time with Blue might not be the wisest course I could take. But it sure beat the hell out of playing referee between Georgia and Risa. Truth be told, it was getting old, and I was tired. Chapter 9, Georgia. We'd all settled in at Tango's and had a few drinks under our belts by the time my brother and his wife showed up. They both looked annoyed as hell, and I was sure that Mike was the cause of it. I was glad that Mike wasn't there, but I did have to wonder about that. For now, though, I was just going to take my lucky stars that he'd chosen, for whatever reason, not to show up. I got up and went to meet Ryan and Mary before they made it to the tables we'd pushed together. I wanted to talk to my brother without the crowd. "Little brother," I said, hugging him. Then I asked, "Join me at the bar?" He gave me a "what's this about" look, but said, "You buying?" I said, "As a matter of fact, I am." I latched onto his arm and led him toward the bar. Mary followed us, and I didn't mind. She had as much right to know that things were about to change for them as he did. Tango walked over to us and smiled. "What'll it be, Georgia?" He tossed the bar towel over his shoulder and asked, "Another kilo, miss?" Then he glanced at Ryan, saying, "The usual?" Ryan nodded and climbed up on a bar stool. Mary and I climbed the stools on either side of him. Tango gave us our beers and leaned against the counter. "Georgia," he said, "I sure would love it if you'd take the stage while you're here." I said, "I'd love to, Tango." I didn't have to think about it. Tango had been real supportive of me back in the day. So I asked, "How about Saturday night?" The wedding was Saturday afternoon, and I was sure that by the time Tango's was happening, the reception would be winding down, so Ginger and I could sneak over here. Hell, everybody would probably end up here anyway. Maybe Tommy would come too. "Saturday night," Tango said with a measure of glee. He climbed up on the bar, took my face in his hands, and planted a kiss on the top of my head, then added, "You're an angel, Georgia." "Some people might disagree," I said, and let out a nervous laugh. Tango chuckled, saying, "Yeah, but they all want to hear you sing." In any other city, maybe, but here in Cypress Falls, what everyone truly wanted was to hear Risa sing. At least those who'd heard her back in the day when she used to do the singing. But I didn't want to go there, so I said, "Well, they'll get their chance Saturday night." I thought about it, Saturday night, and with a name like Georgia Franklin headlining the place, there was money to be made. "Hey, Tango," I said, "you should charge a cover," I added, because Lord knows I wasn't about to charge Tango for the appearance. "Looking forward to it," Tango said, then pointed at me and winked and strode away. I turned to Ryan. He said, "You really going to sing here this weekend?" I shrugged. "Sure, why not?" I said and took a gulp of my beer. Ryan looked like he was about to say something, and then he shook his head and muttered, "Never mind." My curiosity was piqued. "What?" I asked. "It's just that some people around here have a preconceived notion of you," he said with a hint of amusement lighting his tone. I laughed, then said, "Then they'll be surprised, won't they?" I leaned toward Ryan, hesitating long enough to get serious. "So what's the deal with you and Mike?" Ryan shook his head. "I haven't a clue," he said. "Ever since him and Risa split up, it's like he wants me out of the dealership." "You shouldn't let him bully you," I said. "You should have been at the barbecue today." Ryan shook his head, saying, "That's easier said than done, sis. I need my job. I have a family to think about, and times are tough." He stopped to rub his hand over his face. Then he continued, "There just aren't any job openings around Cypress Falls these days." "This is between you and me, for now," I said. "But Mike is going to be leaving Russell's Ford in the very near future." "What?" He didn't try to hide his confusion. "He's shutting it down?" "No," I said. "Russell's Ford will go on, just not with Mike." "Georgia, I don't understand," Ryan said. "Who's going to run it?" I shrugged. "That's up to you and Risa." "Me and Risa," Ryan said in a confused tone that reminded me of when he was a kid. I said, "As soon as the wedding's over and Lisa and Ethan are off on their honeymoon, you and Risa will become the new owners of Russell's Ford." Ryan stared at me for a few seconds, then shook his head. "Mike'll never go for that." Luckily, I tipped my beer toward him in a salute. He won't have a choice. Chapter 10. Risa. I can't say I was particularly thrilled about a trip up to the falls on Friday morning, the day before the wedding. And I don't know why I didn't decline when Ginger suggested it last night. But Malibu looked so eager to go, and he looked equally eager for me to go as well. It had been a long time since I'd felt like a desirable woman, and I aimed to keep that up for the next few days. Once he went back to California, it'd be back to the same old for me. I didn't miss all the girls, and even some of the guys, steadily gawking at Malibu's rock-hard physique as he peeled off his t-shirt and laid it on one of the boulders we gravitated to. He looked like a statue of Adonis come to life. Damn, he was good to look at. I'll admit, I was a little shocked that girls, a lot younger than me and closer to his own age, were practically fighting to catch his eye. But he didn't appear to notice any of them. He seemed fixated on me. It was both stimulating and suspect. "So," Malibu said, leaning back against the boulder, "how do you feel about your daughter getting married?" Wasn't sure how to answer that. I shrugged and said, "Well, they seem to be in love." I let my words trail off, as this wasn't a conversation I wanted to have with a virtual stranger. In a nutshell, I thought my daughter's married life was going to be a tough one. Her soon-to-be mother-in-law didn't like her simply because she was a carbon copy of her Aunt Georgia. But that was something that couldn't be helped. I didn't think it was fair for Lisa to have to suffer the sins of my sister. Add that to the fact that Mike was showing his ass lately, and it was a ripe breeding ground for disaster. Malibu said, "I'll take your word for it." He tilted his head to one side, adding, "Let's hope it lasts." I said, "I'll be the first to admit that love fades. It had for Mike and me. I'm not sure when it happened, but I woke up one morning and truly did not recognize the man next to me. Oh, he still looked the same, handsome as ever, but I no longer saw the qualities in him that made me fall in love with him in the first place. They were no longer there. And trust me, realizing the love you used to feel has withered away is a sad, sad moment that I wouldn't wish on anyone." "Sometimes," Malibu said with a shrug. "But you should never close the door on new love." I laughed and said, "I'm not that jaded." Malibu looked at me with a lethal smile. "You know the kind that makes you want to ditch everything and run off with the guy." "So, do you ever come out to California?" he asked. I shook my head. "Can't say that I do." "Well, you should," he said, and that surprised me. Why did he want me to come out to California? I bit the bullet and asked, "Why?" "Because I'd like to see more of you," he said. "Why?" I asked again. Malibu shook his head and kind of laughed. Not an "I'm laughing at you" laugh. It was more of a "I've got my work cut out for me" laugh. "You want a beer or something?" I asked, mainly to change the subject. He gave me a curious look and said, "Where are we going to find beer out here?" I said, "The back of Tommy's truck." "Sheriff?" he asked. It hit me how bad that sounded. I tried to play it off, saying, "Well, he is off duty." "Hey, Mama." Lisa was beside me now. Malibu pushed himself off the boulder and said, "I'll see if I can get us a beer from the sheriff." He winked at me, then dipped his head at Lisa before trotting off. "He's cute," Lisa said to me with a bit of a giggle. I said, "As a girl who's getting married tomorrow, you shouldn't be noticing that." "Why?" she laughed. "I am getting married," she said with a one-sided shrug, and then added, "but I'm not dead." "Never you mind," I said. I wasn't going to have this kind of conversation with my daughter, of all people. So she turned and leaned against the boulder beside me, Her face turned serious, and I started to worry as she added, "There's something I've got to talk to you about." Oh God, I thought. What? A bad feeling settled in my gut and twisted me all in knots as I asked, "What's going on?" "Well," she said, "you know that Ethan's been applying to some med schools around the country." "Yeah," I said cautiously. "I'd assumed that Ethan would go to LSU or Tulane or maybe Ole Miss." That bad feeling of mine was starting to turn to dread. I asked, "He'd get accepted somewhere?" She nodded, so I said, "Somewhere great, I take it." She said, "UCLA." My heart deflated. My daughter was going to move to California, but Georgia would undoubtedly become the center of her life. Would things get any worse? She said, "It's a great opportunity for Ethan, Mama." She was far more excited about moving away than I wanted her to be. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more supportive of the idea than I really was. She said, "But I don't know if he's going to get to accept it." Her voice was as dejected now as her slumping shoulders. "Why not?" I asked. "He's going to be really expensive," she said. "I'm not sure we can handle it." "Your dad and I will help," I said, and after a short pause I added, "and I'm sure that Tommy and Kathy will help too." Well, at least Tommy would. Kathy, probably not so much. That woman wasn't going to do anything that'd make her son's marriage to George's niece any easier. "It takes a lot of money to pay for med school," she said, "and then pay rent, buy food, and all that stuff." I could hear the disillusion in Lisa's voice, and I could see it in her saddened expression. Clearly, going to UCLA was Ethan's dream. But there was a little something standing in his way, a lack of funds. Well, there was only one thing left to do. I dreaded the thought of even suggesting it, but my daughter's happiness depended upon it. "Don't you worry," I said, and touched her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. I added, "I'm sure your Aunt Georgia would be willing to help out." "Oh, Mama," Lisa said, and then flashed me a horrified look as she added, "I couldn't ask Aunt Georgia." And things just got worse from there. I said, "No," then shrugged and blew out a sigh before adding, "But I can." She asked, "You will?" Hope peered out in her tone, and I didn't want to disappoint her, so I said, "I'm sure Georgia wouldn't mind pitching in. And I'm sure that, between Georgia and Ginger, a place for you and Ethan to stay should not be a problem." As much as I blamed Georgia for deserting the band, I also knew she'd do anything for Lisa. Even so, I wasn't looking forward to asking her this favor. But I, too, would do anything for Lisa, including groveling at Georgia's feet. Chapter 11. Ginger. I had thought the trip to the falls across the Mississippi state line would end up being family and close friends only. As it turned out, people I didn't even know showed up. You see, I'm not much for a crowd. I know it sounds odd, with me being an attorney and all. So Blue and I climbed up to the brim of the falls. I liked the view from up top. It was interesting, to say the least. George and Tommy were sitting together at the edge of the waterfall's pool. They were barefoot, dangling their feet over the edge, chatting and laughing and having a good time. I envied them. There was no history of failed romance between them. They'd never gotten that far. But no, they stood a real shot at happiness, I thought, as I looked at them. Reese and Malibu were off to the side, sitting on a boulder. They were deeply engrossed in conversation, so much so, in fact, that Reese didn't even seem to notice Mike and his floozy coming in from a parking lot. Mike was holding the girl's hand, but he was clearly looking for someone. And my guess was Risa. The girl he was with had long brown hair and a shade or two darker than Risa's. I couldn't see her well enough to guess her age. "What's so fascinating down there?" Jeffrey Dean asked. I shrugged. I wasn't going to tell him. Instead, I said, "Who are all those people? I don't even know half of them." He gestured at the scene below us, saying, "Those people are a product of progress. Cypress Falls didn't stop growing just because we left." The disheartening part, I think that somewhere in the darkest corners of our minds, me and Georgia and Blue all thought that our Cypress Falls would be waiting for us if and when we decided to come home. And that, unfortunately, had not been the case. Jeffrey Dean must have seen the melancholy in my eyes, because he scooted closer and wrapped his arm around me. "Cheer up," he said. "You still got me." I couldn't help but laugh. No, I didn't have Blue. I never had. Not really. And that made it all the worse. "Yeah," I said, "and I also have 2 practically grown children." He said, "When do I get to meet them?" "They'll be here Saturday morning," I said cautiously. "Cool," he laughed. "I've got some stories to share." I cut him a glare that I doubted would do anything to stop him, but a girl could hope. "That's not even remotely funny," I said. He laughed anyway. "It's kind of funny." He looked at me as if he were waiting for me to smile. That's why I didn't. He said, "Ginger, why don't you stop shutting me out?" I closed my eyes and blew out a sigh. When I opened my eyes, his own baby blues were locked and loaded on me. "Jeffrey Dean," I said, "this was all kinds of fun back when we were kids." I shook my head. "But I can't do this now." "Can't do what?" he asked with a grin. "All this flirting," I said. "I just can't do it." I leapt to my feet. I needed to put a little distance between us. I said, "I know it's not a big deal to you. You seem to thrive on it." I turned back to face him. He was still sitting in the same spot, staring up at me. I said, "But I don't. I don't thrive on it. In fact, it irks the hell out of me." I studied him for a brief time. It was amazing how being in his presence had practically wiped out all those years it had taken me to get over him. I said, "It took me a long time to get over you." He asked playfully, "You got over me?" I nodded. "Well, that sucks," he said. I shot him a curious look. He pushed himself up and moved toward me, saying, "I never got over you." He tried to draw me in with his gaze. He almost succeeded. The minute I realized what he was doing, I shut it down. I said, "No," practically stomping my foot, then added, "You can't do this. We can't do this." "Yes, we can," he said. "You ever wonder why I never got married? And you've been married so damn many times?" Crap. I was hoping he didn't know anything about my life as a serial bride. I shook my head. Blue shrugged and said, "I've compared every woman I've ever met to you. And you, I suspect that you wanted all of those husbands of yours to make you feel the way I did." He studied me for a bit, then asked, "Am I right?" "Don't you see?" I asked, exasperated. "It doesn't matter. That was a lifetime ago. Too much water has flowed under the bridge." Blue shot me a confused look and asked, "What does water flowing under a bridge have to do with anything?" "It's a metaphor, Jeffrey Dean," I said. "It's stupid is what it is," he practically growled. Oh God, that man infuriated me so. "Ginger," he said, and shot me a look of pure conviction. "I made a mistake years ago, and I'm trying like hell to rectify it, but you're refusing to let me." "What are you saying?" Even as I asked the question, I knew it was a bad idea. "I still love you, Ginger," he said. "I always have, I always will." You don't love me, I said, and rolled my eyes and burst out laughing. You haven't seen me in over 20 years. How can you possibly love me? Simple, he shrugged. I never stopped. Blue took another step closer to me. I closed my eyes. If I didn't look at him, maybe he'd go away. If he touched me, I was in trouble. I could feel him fiddling with a strand of my hair. He said, "Did I tell you how much I like the blonde?" I shook my head, thinking, No, you didn't. I needed him to leave me alone. Either that, or just go ahead and take me to bed. Chapter 12. Georgia. I looked at myself in the mirror and smoothed my hands over the elegant sheath made of jade green lace that I'd picked up in L.A. right before the trip. At 42, I still looked pretty good, I thought, but in the end, all that really mattered was what Tommy thought. Wow, Ginger's voice filtered in from just outside the doorway of my old room. You look great, she added. I took one last look in the mirror and said, It'll do, I guess. I turned toward the door. Ginger was wearing Jill Sander. It hit me. The only thing that was going to stand out at tonight's dinner table was Ginger's boobs. I said, That'll do the trick. What trick? She asked, all innocent-like. Making Jeffrey Dean eat his heart out, I told her. Good, she said as she came into the room and plopped down on the bed. She added, He's really starting to get on my nerves. Yeah, right, I said, grabbing the gold lace wrap. I draped it around my shoulders, adding, You're eating it up like candy. I can't help it, she said and fell backward on the bed, adding, He's still as good-looking as ever. I asked, Is he coming out to L.A.? I don't know, she said. I'm afraid to ask. You're afraid to ask? I laughed. You're afraid he's not going to take that sportscasting job. She pushed herself back up to sit on the edge of the bed. She said, That is entirely not true. She glared at me on the verge of laughing herself. Just ask him about it, I said, and pulled a bottle of perfume out of my toiletry bag. I uncapped it, sniffed it, and decided to spritz on a little. I added, Then you can invite him to stay at your house. Ginger tossed a pillow at me. I ducked. It hit the door jamb. Damn, you're still fast, she said. That's either going to pay off big time or really kill the mood when Tommy makes his move. I said, Stop it, rolling my eyes. I stuffed the perfume back inside my bag and said, I've got bigger fish to fry. Let's face it, there wasn't much that was more important to me than Tommy, but I had to look out for my brother and sister. I was fairly confident that Tommy would be waiting in the wings when the dust settled. The problem was, by that time, I'd be back in California. Ginger said, So, what's the status with Mike and the dealership? Are you really going to take it? Yep, I said with a nod. What do you think Tommy's going to say? She asked. I said, He knows. I leaned against the dresser, studied my pink-tipped fingernails for a moment, then looked at Ginger and said, I told him at the barbecue. What'd he say? She asked. I said, in a nutshell, good for you, Georgia. That's too bad, she said with a shrug. For Mike, anyway. How so? I asked. Tommy was his only hope, she chuckled. Ginger's gaze traveled around my room, and her expression grew somber. What? I asked. Ginger seemed to be staring off into space when she said, Do you think something's going on with Lisa and Ethan? I sat down on the edge of the bed and asked, Why do you say that? I don't know, she says, shaking her head. It's just a feeling I get. I haven't talked to them much, I said. Just a quick hello at the barbecue. Everything seemed okay, I added with a shrug. Ginger got up and went to my dresser, saying, Maybe it's just me. She began poking around in my old jewelry box. I couldn't imagine what she'd want with the stuff in there. It was just a bunch of old junk that I hadn't bothered to take with me to California. Suddenly, she damn near squealed. "Oh my God!" She turned around, holding a guy's class ring. "What's that?" I asked. Curiosity pushed me up and moved me toward her. I'd never gotten a ring from a guy in high school. I took it from her and inspected it. She asked, "You don't recognize it?" "No," I said, checking the band. I saw the initials JDR. I looked up at Ginger. "What in the hell is Jeffrey Dean's ring doing in my jewelry box?" She took it back from me. "Don't you remember?" she asked. "I hid it in your jewelry box so Mama wouldn't find out I had it." I said, "You never told me that." "Yes, I did," she insisted. "No, you didn't," I said. Then I filled with curiosity, so I asked, "You going to give it back to him?" "I think I will," she said. "Finally going to break up with him, huh?" I chuckled. We both laughed. Ginger glanced at her watch and said, "We'd better go. You don't want to be late." "For what?" I asked. "It ain't my party." "Your date with Tommy," Ginger said. "You don't want to be late for that." I told her, "I don't have a date with Tommy." She said, "I happen to know that he asked to be seated next to you at dinner tonight." She shot me an "I'm amused" sort of glance. It was all I could do not to jump up and down. For me, it would have been enough just to be at the same table with him at the rehearsal dinner. Sitting beside him took it to a whole other level, one that I'd only ever dreamed about. A silly schoolgirl type of feeling swooped over me. I looked at Ginger, sucked in a breath, and said firmly, "Come on, we don't want to be late." She laughed and pushed me out into the hallway. Down the stairs, we found Lisa at the front door. I tried to tamp down the surprised look that must have been shining on my face as I exclaimed, "Lisa!" "Girl," Ginger blurted out, "what in the hell are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Catfish Joe's." Yeah, and so are we, if Ginger wanted to get technical. Lisa shrugged helplessly. "I'm looking for y'all." I didn't like it when people, especially my niece, looked this upset the day before her wedding. "What's up?" I asked, overwrought with worry. "I need a fresh perspective," she said. I moved toward her, latched onto her arm, and said, "Okay, come on, we can talk in the car." "You want me to ride with y'all?" she asked, as I led her out onto the porch. "Yes," I said. "You're late for the rehearsal dinner, and your mother is going to have my head." Ginger did her thing and climbed behind the wheel of our rental car. I took shotgun, and Lisa got into the back seat. Then I realized someone was missing. I looked at Ginger, asking, "Where's Malibu?" Ginger let her eyes do the pointing toward Lisa in the back seat. She said, "Take a guess." I didn't need to guess. It was obvious. And I don't know why I didn't think of it myself. Malibu was with Risa. I was going to have a talk with him. I wanted him to cheer her up, not break her heart. "Gosh," Lisa said, "that guy sure is cute." "Sis, the woman who's getting married tomorrow," I chuckled. Lisa laughed. "That's what Mama said." Ginger guided the car along the driveway. I glanced back at Lisa. "So what's up?" I asked. It took her a minute, but she finally said, "I'm kinda overwhelmed." Her voice was shaky, like she could break down at any minute. Ginger said, "That's understandable. You're getting married." Like it was no big deal. Lisa sighed. I said, "You are getting married." I fixed my gaze on her, adding, "Right?" "I want to," she said. I love Ethan." She sounded like she was trying to convince herself. And that worried me. I said, "Why do I feel like there's a but in there somewhere?" Lisa fidgeted in the back seat, pulling on the hem of her dress. "You have to promise you won't tell any of this to Mama," she said. "She'll have a cow." "Oh, shit," Ginger whispered. "Sure, okay," I said, tossing my hands in the air. "What's one more thing for your mother to hate me over?" "She doesn't mean anything by it, Aunt Georgia," Lisa said, defending Risa, and that touched me. I didn't fall into her emotional trap, though. I said firmly, "Don't try to change the subject." Lisa laughed and said, "You're way more like Mama than she knows." "Tell Risa that," Ginger laughed, looking into the rearview mirror, and watched her head explode. "Okay, stop, both of you," I said, trying not to laugh myself. Lisa obviously had something she needs to get off her chest. "Promise," Lisa said, her eyes on Ginger. I smacked Ginger's arm. "Your turn." Yeah, okay," Ginger nodded. Finally, Lisa said softly, "It's Ethan's mom. She hates me." I shook my head, saying, "She doesn't hate you." And then immediately the words, "Did she?" ran through my thoughts. "Yes," Lisa said surely. "She told me last week that she'll never accept me as Ethan's wife." "What?" Ginger blurted out. "Seriously?" I asked. Lisa nodded. Tears pooled in her eyes as she said, "Ethan deserves better than that." I had a lot of pent-up anger toward Kathy, and this was my chance to let it out, so I said, "That bitch. I'm going to kick her ass," Ginger swore as she slammed her hand against the steering wheel. I turned in my seat as far as I could manage. "You love Ethan," I said to Lisa. "You said you love him, right?" Lisa nodded. Yes, I do." "Then you forget about Kathy," I said. "I guarantee you, Tommy doesn't feel that way. And Ethan, he deserves to be married to the woman he loves." I twisted back around toward the front, adding, "Screw that bitch." "Don't tell her that," Ginger chastised me. "You've never had to deal with a mother-in-law. You have no idea what that's like." "I tell you what I do know," I paused, gathering my wits. "I know that, from here on out, Ethan is going to end up estranged from his mother one way or another." I shrugged, adding, "She's going to be mad at him if he marries Lisa, and he's going to be mad at her if she's the reason Lisa calls it off. So he might as well be with the woman he loves." "That's true," Ginger said with a nod. "I don't know." Lisa didn't sound convinced. "I'm not sure if I can come between Ethan and his mother." "Forget about Kathy," I said. "She'll get over it." I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some little part of me that was enjoying the thought of finally getting a jab in at Kathy. To me, she'd taken my chance with Tommy. If she hadn't gotten herself knocked up, then he would have come out to California, and who knows what would have happened after that. Chapter 13. Ginger. Who would have thought that Catfish Joe's, a restaurant a couple of miles upriver from my parents' house, had a round table that was large enough to seat my parents, me and Blue, George and Tommy, Malibu, Risa, Lisa, Ethan, Kathy, her husband, and their 3 kids, my brother, Ryan, his wife, and their 2 boys, and Mike. The beauty of this was that you could talk about the people on the opposite side of the table, and they would be none the wiser. As the bride and groom, Lisa and Ethan, were seated at the designated head of the table, if there was such a thing at a round table, Risa was sitting next to Lisa. Kathy was on Ethan's free side. Tommy had given up his seat as father of the groom, which was at Kathy's side, to her new husband. Tommy seemed much more content at Georgia's side on the other side of the table. Malibu ended up sitting between me and Georgia because Mike had thrown a hissy fit about sitting beside Risa, and where was his girlfriend anyway? Georgia and Tommy were huddled together, thick as thieves. Risa and Malibu were pining away for each other with longing glances across the table, while Mike tried desperately to get Risa's attention. I guess maybe it's true what they say. A woman is never quite so appealing as when another man enters the picture. Mike looked like he was eating his heart out now. I hope he choked on it. Kathy was watching Georgia and Tommy. You could practically see the steam billowing from her ears. I wondered if she'd be able to hold it together, or if she'd erupt before dinner was over. Ethan and Lisa were sitting quietly. She looked troubled, and he looked worried. And my parents? My mother looked tired. It was weird. Ever since we'd arrived in Cypress Falls, I hadn't seen her do much of anything except rest. And if you knew my mother, you'd know how weird that was. Blue leaned toward me and whispered, "Maybe it's just me, but this table is a disaster waiting to happen." "You noticed that too, huh?" I asked. "My sister is not happy," he said. I knew Blue cared about Kathy and what happened to her, but there was a measure of amusement in his voice. "Yeah," I said, "she looks madder than a wet hen in a tote sack," I added with my eyes still glued to Kathy. Blue burst out laughing. I paid him no mind. Instead, I glanced from Kathy to Tommy and Georgia, and then back to Kathy again. Her husband looked like he'd rather be anywhere but here. I looked at Blue. "It's kind of weird," I said, "since she's remarried and has 3 kids with the dude." Blue said, "Tommy should know better." I said, "You can't blame this on Tommy." I shot Blue a look. "You know, the kind that says, 'We're never going to see eye to eye on this, so you should probably shut up.'" I added, "You can't help who you love." "Oh, I'm not saying anything against him," Jeffrey Dean said. "He did right by my sister, even though he was in love with somebody else, so I can't find fault with that." "So what's your beef?" I said. Blue shook his head, saying, "He knows how volatile Kathy is where George is concerned. He shouldn't flaunt her in front of Kathy. Not here, not now." Okay, so maybe he had a point, but I just couldn't find any sympathy for Kathy. She knew what she was getting into when she married Tommy Dixon. She knew his heart belonged to someone else. I wanted this conversation to fade away, and quickly. I didn't want to pick a fight with Blue. "I'll agree with you on one thing," I said, steering the conversation back to more recent events. "The table is a pressure cooker that could blow at any minute." "Well," he said with a grin, "we could slip out and go find someplace quiet." He winked at me. "We are not leaving," I said, mortified. The last thing I wanted was for my mother to see me and Blue slipping out. Mama would definitely assume the worst, and I'd never hear the end of it. "Well," he said with a wink, "I guess we'll stay and watch the show." I pulled my gaze away from Kathy, letting my eyes drift to Risa. Mike was still trying to talk to her, and she was looking extremely annoyed, and she couldn't keep her eyes off Malibu. My gaze traveled on to my parents. I swear my mother wasn't herself. I guess maybe the wedding had tired her out. Back to Georgia and Tommy. She leaned toward him and whispered something into his ear. He laughed and draped his arm around the back of her chair, where he caressed her arm. From the corner of my eye, I saw the commotion at the other side of the table as I heard the glasses and dishes clanging together. I even felt some sprinkling, like it was beginning to rain or something. I think it was getting wet more than all the noise that pulled my gaze toward the commotion. Kathy was on her feet, and all who'd been in the line of fire of her wine glass, which she'd thrown down on the table, were drying themselves with their napkins. Kathy had gone from looking unhappy to plain old pissed off. Glaring at Tommy and Georgia, she wailed, "Why don't you two just go ahead and get a room and get it over with?" Georgia's mouth fell open slightly. The color drained from her face. Her eyes flittered around the table, not sticking anywhere for more than a nanosecond or two. She sucked in a breath and slowly rose from her chair, pushed it back, and ran out. Tommy blew out his frustration as he got up and dropped his napkin on his plate. He shook his head, flashed Kathy a "you're pitiful" look, and went after Georgia. Kathy looked down at Ethan. "You see," she said. There was bitterness in her tone. Way too much bitterness for a woman who'd been divorced from Tommy for damn near 20 years. "How can you marry into that family," she asked, "knowing that your father has always wanted Georgia? It's always been her." "Oh my God," I heard my mother's muffled voice from across the table. I glanced at her. Her face was in her hand. She peered at my father through louvered fingers. I saw her mouth the words, "Take me home, please." As my father stood up, he reached for my mother's hand while glaring at Kathy. He looked like he was about to read her the riot act, but instead, he let his gaze drift to the bride and groom. "Lisa, Ethan," he said, "you truly deserve better than this." And everybody at the table knew he meant better than Kathy.